welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hosler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with a personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Welcome back to the Movement Upgraded podcast. This is episode number 5. We are essentially going to be applying a lot of what we covered in episode 4 in this episode. So we're going to cover what mobility is and how it compares to traditional strength training. I'm very excited about this because this is a big part of my work and what I do with people. So if you have not listened to episode 4 and you aren't super familiar with exercise science or strength training principles, go back and listen to episode 4. If you are not somebody who is trained in any of the exercise world, not a trainer or a coach, this may be a little bit more challenging for you to understand, but that doesn't mean you can't. So our goal is to get you to kind of understand some of these concepts and be able to apply them. So what we're really going to talk about today is really what mobility training is, and compared to what we normally think about mobility. And we're going to also talk about how it compares to traditional strength training. Then we're going to discuss the 3 biggest mistakes most people make on their mobility journey. And then you're not going to be one of those people after this episode. So that's kind of our goal. So this will be a great way for you if you are new to mobility work to kind of begin to understand what mobility work is. If you feel like you've done some mobility work or really dabble in it a little, this might be a great way for you to audit your current practice. And if you have done it a lot and you just want to listen because you love all things related to mobility work, you are my people. Actually, all of you are my people because you're here listening. So that's what we are going to cover today. So without further ado, let's just talk about what you think of when you think mobility work or mobility exercises. Most people, if I were to ask that question, would think of things like foam rolling, or maybe smashing a lacrosse ball into your tissues, maybe yoga, or maybe doing some sort of mobility flows, or maybe just stretching. Those are all the most common things that people think of and are often thinking that I do with people when they hear that I talk a lot about mobility. And I also was one of those people. So I am coming from this as somebody who's learned this as well. I started a lot of my understanding of movement with Kelly Starrett's Mobility WOD and Gray Cook's book Movement. And I am so appreciative of their work because it paved the way for me to be able to do this work. And also, their work is not the end all be all. So it was a great way for us to get interested in mobility, but we can progress from there and actually really start to understand it from a scientific point of view. So let's talk about why those things that I just mentioned are not necessarily true mobility training. And I want to talk about this mostly because one of the biggest issues with mobility work is that we just view it so differently than other forms of exercise. And this is a problem because we have a lot of joint related issues and pain, and that is a problem because it limits us from moving. If you're in pain, you don't want to move as much, and that's a big barrier to exercise, and exercise is really important for our health and longevity. So I care a lot about this because I want to make sure that you can stay moving as long as possible. I don't want you to feel pain or feel like you don't enjoy movement anymore because you now have this barrier of getting injured a lot or being in pain all the time. And so it matters. Mobility training and understanding it matters so that we can actually tackle these things instead of just kind of putting band-aids over things and then getting frustrated. So it matters because putting band-aids over those things and getting frustrated ends up becoming something that we either just keep doing and get more and more frustrated, or it basically impedes us from wanting to exercise at all. And I don't want that to happen. So that's why we're here. But why we view it so differently, I don't really know where that started, but I really do see that we completely lose the understandings of an application of exercise science principles and understanding of adaptations. That's the underlying principles we really need to understand when it comes to mobility work. Mobility work is a form of exercise. It is going to follow those principles, and we're going to talk about that today. It's just going to be prioritizing and looking at things from a different perspective, but it's still going to utilize those same principles. So we cannot just abandon those principles just because we don't fully understand mobility work. And that is what I'd like to highlight today. So we really just need to understand what we're trying to accomplish with mobility work, why we're trying to accomplish it, and how exactly that happens, or what we need to do in order to accomplish said thing. And so let's kind of talk about first why foam rolling and mobility flows and yoga are not necessarily mobility training, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what really mobility training is. So let's start with foam rolling and smashing, quote unquote, your tissues. I did this a ton when I was younger. I've talked about this in episode 3, all of my stories. A lot of what I originally did was foam rolling and smashing a lacrosse ball in my tissues. All throughout physical therapy school, I was jamming a lacrosse ball into that knot in my shoulder. I spent 10 to 15 minutes on a foam roller before every workout. I thought it was going to help me, and it did. It probably saved me from needing pain medication. So at that point, it's still going to be not the worst thing you can do, but it's probably not going to give you the results, and it's definitely not doing the things that are always talked about on social media. So a lot of times people will say the benefits of foam rolling and smashing a ball into your tissues are breaking up knots or breaking up scar tissue or breaking up adhesions. And there's no scientific evidence to support any of those things. What is really happening is we are just creating a temporary relaxation response in our body. So we're kind of promoting some parasympathetic activity there. We're going back into that rest and digest mode, depending on how intense it is. Of course, if you're really digging, it's going to be more sympathetic. You're going to start sweating. But if you're really kind of just like chilling on the foam roller or kind of just like rolling around a little bit, smashing a little, but not like digging into your tissues, it's just getting them to relax. And you might have a small amount of tone or decreased like tension, and you might get more range of motion, but it will all be temporary. It'll go away within like 15 or 20 minutes, usually, sometimes a couple hours, but it's all going to be temporary because you're not actually training anything. You're essentially just like creating a small change from your nervous system. That's the best way that I can describe that without getting too nerdy. So most people are super busy in our lives, and we only have time to do so many things. There are a lot of other things that can promote more parasympathetic activity and produce those parasympathetic benefits that will also have a lot of other benefits like cars or breath work. And so when it comes to foam rolling and smashing your tissues, do I care if somebody I work with does that? No. Do I care if it impedes their ability to do the actual work that's going to create the results they want? Yes. So I'll have that conversation. I don't ever tell people not to do something. I just tell them you need to prioritize the important things that are actually going to get you what you want. And usually that is not going to be foam rolling and smashing your tissues. Now, if the only way you can get yourself to do your exercises is to allow yourself to foam roll for 30 seconds, then go ahead. But don't waste too much time on it. Your benefits that you're going to get out of it are not going to be increased if you spend more time doing it. In fact, you're probably just going to end up wasting your time over in the long run. So that's why foam rolling and smashing your tissues is not really the answer. It's not mobility training. You're not training anything. It's not mobility work. You're just temporarily changing how things feel in your body. What about mobility flows then? And this is something that this was like the next step for me. This was when I was learning mobility, like, oh, these flows. First of all, they look really cool. People on social media who are big into mobility, they post a lot of mobility flows. It looks awesome. We love seeing people move and do amazing movements with their bodies. I won't deny that. It's really cool. Most of the results or the ability for them to do those movements is not coming from them doing those movements. It's coming from them doing legit mobility training, which is really boring and not as sexy. I've recorded some of it I don't share it because it's really boring. You just can't see much happening. It's not pretty movements. And I just want to remind you that it's not this fun expression of movement, which is what mobility flows are, right? Let's pause for just a minute and make sure we're on the same page of what a mobility flow is, though. So usually when we think about a mobility flow, quote unquote, it's usually just a series of movements that people put together that are just flowing from one movement to another. Sometimes they feel really good because they're getting us into positions or ranges of motion we normally wouldn't. So you get a little bit of stretching there, which also really feels good because it's a new sensation, and stretching sensations can really feel like they can be parasympathetic. You'll notice all of the things that I'm talking about today that are quote unquote mobility are just really parasympathetic, and that's why they feel so good. And again, there's other ways to get more parasympathetic that are probably going to benefit you more, like breath work. But anyways, mobility flows, that's kind of what a mobility flow is. It's just a bunch of exercises, movements put together, flowing from one position to another. And they'll feel good because they're movement. And like I said, they're new stimulus, new movements, new positions. So a lot of people love them. They're usually not the same thing. They're usually different every time. They're not programmed. A lot of people use these as warm-ups or cool downs. They use them as quote unquote restorative days, and they're usually more gentle movement or generalized physical activity, which is totally fine. That counts towards that checkbox for you, counts towards that exercise physical activity stuff, and it might feel really good. It gets your blood flowing, and again, gets you a little more parasympathetic, but it's not true training. It's not going to create adaptations in your body. That's mobility training. It's just flowing. And there are some ways to take the mobility flows and make them a little bit more towards mobility training. But then it's going to be mobility training and you're not just doing a flow. So it's really just important to understand that delineation. And it really boils down to your intention behind it. So what is your goal behind the mobility flow that you're going to do? Do you know what adaptations or what changes you're trying to create at your joints and in those tissues or at in those positions? Or are you just kind of flowing and just trying to feel some stretching sensations? That's not bad. It's just if your intention is to get a better hip so you can squat deeper, you need to do something that's going to specifically get you, an individual, a better hip, which means you need to know what your hip lacks and then how to get a better hip, not just pick these flows that you see on Instagram that look really cool. So I I fell for this a lot and was like, oh, this is what all these mobile people are doing. Well, they're doing it because it looks cool on Instagram, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's never really what actually got them to be flexible or mobile in the first place. So keep that in mind. So that is why mobility flows are not really training. The last thing I'm going to talk about is yoga. So what about yoga then? And I don't hate yoga despite what some people might think, because I talk about it a lot in context of it's not accomplishing X, but that's because yoga cannot be everything. It has been touted as this answer for all things, and it cannot be everything. Not everything can be everything. Not everything can be everything. I'm just going to say it twice. You cannot have yoga as strength training. Yoga cannot be strength training, cannot be all of the things because of the idea of specificity. The idea of yoga is to get you to slow down and create some mindfulness with your movement, bring you home, center you. It plays a lot into some of our mental health. It gets you a little bit more parasympathetic, and it can be a great new form of movement expression, learning something new in the form of movement. It's pretty cool. I've taken yoga classes. I used to work at a yoga studio. When we first started Movement Upgraded, we shared space in a yoga studio, and I got to learn a little bit about it. I am not an expert by any means. I don't pretend to play a yoga expert. I'm not a yogi, but I do know that yoga is not mobility training, and the purpose of yoga is to make you better at yoga. That's the goal. And some different forms of yoga might have different intentions behind them, getting you more mindful or getting you to be better at XYZ, but they're not created off of a fundamental understanding of your joints and movement and the science behind those things. That's not what yoga is, which is totally fine. It doesn't need to be everything. So if your goal is to make your joints healthier, feel less stiff and achy, maintain or improve your range of motion or flexibility, and to do any of those things for a specific reason, like a better squat, or just to be able to do your daily lives a little bit better, or to mitigate injuries in the future, then you need to train your body accordingly. You need to be training purposefully and with intention. So as always, the more specific your goal, the more intentional and specific your programming needs to be, which is what we talked about in episode number 4. So if you want better mobility or more usable active ranges of motion, you need active inputs. You're not going to get better at cooking, for example, by ordering takeout. You have to do the thing to learn the skill. So foam rolling and smashing your tissues, or even getting massages, those are things being done to you, but they're not going to necessarily help you get better at moving and build better joints. You actually have to do the thing, right? So if you want to get better at cooking, you actually have to cook and learn that skill. You can't just order takeout all the time. You can't order somebody else to do something for you. It might make you feel good temporarily, but it's just not going to produce the results that you want, which is really what it boils down to. Not which is better than the other. I don't care. I just care if your goal is X, are you going to be able, like, can you expect that from the thing that you're doing? Like, do your expectations match your intentions or your goals? That's really what I care about the most. So your goal is improving your mobility. Does your training and efforts match that? And that's what I'm trying to help you understand today. So those are the 3 biggest things I wanted to cover. Foam rolling, smashing your tissues, mobility flows, yoga. They are not going to give you the results you want. And a lot of people, when they come to my Kinstretch classes or have taken or joined the Kinstretch membership, they will often say Kinstretch is what I always hoped yoga would be for me. And I think it's really important to understand that yoga is not the answer to everything. Even though it is like touted as the answer for like pain and a lot of other issues, it might not be for the reasons that yoga is this mobility answer. It's for the other benefits that yoga has. So that is my little caveat or explanation about what mobility training isn't. So what then is mobility training, or what does it consist of? Hopefully by now you kind of like are piecing together a little understanding of mobility training, but it really comes down to programming inputs to create adaptations in your body. So an input is going to be an exercise. So it's just choosing exercises and the time and the reps and the frequency and all the parameters that come with the exercise, programming them or planning them with a specific purpose or with the intention of creating a certain adaptation in the body. And adaptation might be more strength. It might just be more joint space. It might be access to your tissues in this position. It might be creating a little bit more tissue extensibility. There's a lot of different adaptations that we are searching for when it comes to mobility, and you won't know which ones you need until you've had an assessment. So it's really important to understand that's like an assessment guides everything. You have to know what your body lacks to know what it needs, to know what you have to do in mobility programming. And we're going to talk about that when I talk about the 3 mistakes people make, but that's essentially what it is. And what people don't really understand is that mobility, like training, prioritizes your joints first. It's like we work inside out. And it's hard to understand that if you have never really studied the human body. I didn't really understand a lot of this, but we kind of refer to this as internal training, inside out training. And I'm going to talk about that because it's the opposite of traditional strength training. So let's talk about how traditional strength training kind of compares to mobility training to give you a little bit more of an understanding of mobility work. So they're very similar in that we need to understand specificity. So that whole exercise science, principles of specificity, or creating or choosing a stimulus for an adaptation, that is going to be true for both, right? Those are principles that we follow for exercise in general. Consistency is also really important for both. You want to do the same inputs over time to create those changes, and you have to be consistent with them. Just like we talked about in the last episode, usually strength training programming, you are following for 4 to 8 weeks on a regular basis. You're not changing it. It's the same or similar movements, and you're just trying to progressively, slowly add a little bit. And that is what a normal strength training program looks like. Mobility training is same but different. There's little nuances, but the principles overarching are the same. And then progressive overload. You are still going to need progressive overload because the concept of exercise science principles tell us that our body adapts to what we're doing. And if we are not trying to challenge it a little bit more over time, then we will have accommodation and our body will slowly get worse, or it will slowly lose range of motion or slowly lose flexibility and mobility because we're not actively working on improving it. So those are the similarities. They are the same principles that apply to both. It's just how that gets executed is slightly different. The nuance changes for mobility work. The differences I already kind of touched on a little bit, but essentially the biggest one is understanding that traditional strength training is external strength training and joint mobility training is internal. And this and all of these concepts are definitely something that are talked about in the functional range systems, which is where I took the FRC course. So it's a lot of this information that I'm relaying to you. I will give them a shout out for that. But this is what we talk about. They talk about all the time is understanding that we are looking at your body from the inside out. And we are thinking about, does my joint have the ability to do XYZ as necessary? Just like your shoulder needs to rotate first before it can do anything else, because every movement is rotation because it's a ball and socket joint. Versus traditional strength training is looking at, okay, what are these patterned movements like a squat or deadlift, and am I good at them? And then I'm going to load them so I can get better at them. Or maybe it'll be looking at like the muscles that you can see and wanting to grow those, but it's pretty external. It's not like deep focused on where the movement occurs, which is actually at your joint. So that's a big difference. The other thing is the patterns versus joints. Like I just kind of mentioned this, but most traditional strength training is looking at patterns like the overhead press or the pull up. It's not looking at your individual joint. If you think about a squat, the joints involved in a squat, like it's a very complex movement. You have a lot of your foot joints are moving in that, but I'll just skip over those and we'll just talk about your ankle joint. And then you have your knee joint, you have your hip joint, and then you have some of your lumbar spine joints. They are moving whether or not you think you are in a neutral spine. They're moving when you squat. And that's not even including your shoulder if you're holding a bar, or your elbow and wrist if you're holding a barbell, or your thoracic spine, which is actually moving too. So it is literally almost a full body exercise. It is a patterned movement versus mobility work, which would be like maybe you want to improve your hip mobility and you get assessed and you lack hip internal rotation. Your exercise is not going to be this complicated squat or this weird, crazy hip mobility flow. It's literally just going to be an exercise that's going to improve your hip internal rotation. Of course, that's still not even specific enough because I need to know if you need more passive range of motion, if you need more joint space, or if we need more active control of that internal rotation, which really boils down to strength. That matters too. So that's how specific you have to get. Specificity is not only also important in mobility training, it's actually even more so important than it is for traditional strength training, in my opinion. So we really have to pay attention to understanding that we are trying to, when it comes to mobility, make the parts work better. So your individual joints that I just mentioned for like a squat, if you can make each of those work better by doing the really boring, not fun stuff, then they will all work better and your patterned exercise or movement will get better because the joints involved are better. And this is something that gets asked often. Why would I do a CAR, for example, a controlled articular rotation, if I can just warm up with the squat? And I don't usually think that we should be choosing between those. We should be doing our CARs all the time, but the end goal is, are you getting better at squatting or are you trying to get better at your hip? I don't know what your goal is, but most people are not doing enough to actually just get better at their hip or their ankle or their knee. And we are way too focused on getting better at a squat and other things that we've invented, because what really is a squat? We've just completely invented that. That is a man-made exercise name. Like a squat isn't a real thing, technically, if you really think about it. So that is one of the big things to understand, is that strength training is more about patterns and mobility work is going to be breaking things down individually, because if you have a better joint, everything you do pattern wise will be more efficient and more effective. So it's like one of the reduce things down to build them back up and make them even better in the combination or pattern movements. And so if you work on your better joint, like if you work on creating better joints, you are going to have better pattern movement, but the reverse is not true. So you are going to work on pattern movement. It's going to be the exact same direction. You're loading your joints in the same position. You're never creating or getting to those end ranges of motion, and you're not going to create better joints. You're going to reach an end point, and at some point, if all you're focusing on are pattern movements, you're neglecting a lot of your joints and joint mobility. And that's just the way it is. So we have to make sure we are including some form of mobility work. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of like what mobility really is. Let's talk about the 3 biggest mistakes people make with mobility training, and then we'll kind of wrap this episode up. So I'm not going to bombard you with way too much information today, but what we just talked about really leads into the 3 biggest mistakes very well and kind of brings it all together. So the first thing that I want to talk about is when it comes to wanting to get better mobility or being on a journey for your mobility, whether that's because you're injured or you feel stiff or you just like you want to get better at squatting or something like that, or get a deeper squat, and you just know, like a lot of us just know. This was me when I was younger. It was like I was in a lot of pain, but also I just like knew I needed better mobility because things didn't feel right and whatnot. So the number one thing is lacking intention. That's like the biggest thing. We lack intention with our selection of exercises, so which ones we're doing, and with the implementation of them. And this again boils back down to the specificity. You have to have an assessment done to know what you lack. And in Kinstretch classes, I like to say that a lot of the classes are self-assessments because you start to learn, okay, I lack this range of motion. Okay, we get into this position and I don't even have access to this part of my leg or shoulder in this position. So I lack that. And you learn that because I explain that in my classes. And sometimes that is a longer way, but also a cheaper way to get an assessment done if you can't afford to work with somebody one-on-one. Kinstretch classes are great ways to do that. But you have to do an assessment to know what you lack. And you need to know exactly what you lack. Like not just, I lack hip mobility. That's not specific enough. Do you lack hip joint space? Do you lack internal rotation? Do you lack hip extension? Do you have good hip rotation, but you lack hip flexion strength? There, you have to learn what you lack and specifically what you lack. And then you need to know the adaptations you need. So that would be like what you lack. And then like, do you need better control? Do you need more strength? Do you need more joint space? All the things I just said. So you need to know those adaptations that you need to achieve. And then you have to be intentional about the exercises you're doing. You need to know which exercises create more joint space or more control or more strength. And really control boils down to strength, by the way. It's just a lot of people lack total strength or connection in certain positions, and that lack of connection to your leg or inability to control it and your compensations everywhere, they boil down to a lack of strength. So that is why we need to be a little bit more intentional. So that's like the number one thing is we lack intention with what we're trying to do. Most people, when they set out to go on a mobility journey, we just like mimic what we see on Instagram. We're like, I should try those. I'm not going to say that that's like should never happen. I love Instagram and it's given me so many ideas, and it's really challenged me in a lot of ways to try different things or think differently, and you can get a lot out of it. But if you are really trying to like have a specific goal and make changes and see results, you have to be intentional and not just mimic exercises that you see. Because the exercises you see, one, for all of the things that I just said, may or may not be what the person has actually utilized to achieve the movement or the mobility that they have, even if they tell you that it is. Nobody's checking up on whether or not that's true. But also because that movement, you have no idea what they're feeling or what their goal is with it, unless sometimes they give you some coaching instructions in the bottom of the caption. But that would require you to not just save the exercise, also read the caption and understand, and then be able to change the movement according to what you need to do to feel the right thing. Like you need to be able to feel what you should feel to achieve those adaptations. Most of my work when I work with people is assessing them and then coaching them and finding different positions. We do a lot of trial and error of finding different positions because I will always ask them, what do you feel here? And if you don't know what you're supposed to feel and what you're not, then you can't ever know if that exercise is actually effective for the thing that you want it to do. You have to find the position and or the cue or understand what you're trying to achieve and what you should feel. And this is why, again, Kinstretch is like the beautiful lower tier way of learning all of these things, because we talk about that and I explain those in the classes. And if you take a Kinstretch class with anybody else, they should be doing the same thing, because that's how Kinstretch and a lot of FRC is taught. But we have to really understand what we should be feeling. And my body looks very different than yours and probably very different than anybody that's around you right now. And so when you do a movement, or if you have a certain adaptation that you need to achieve, like better hip control, hip internal rotation strength, I should say, past like 45 degrees, then you need to know where you should be feeling that exercise. And it's just likely going to be a different position than where I do. And that's totally fine. There's no nuance on Instagram. It's also why this podcast exists. So, number one, we lack intention in our selection and implementation. So we need to know both what is it that we need and what is the intention, or what should I be feeling in the exercise, so I know that the exercise is actually achieving the thing I want. Number two is priority. We lack priority. So there, believe it or not, is a hierarchy of importance when it comes to getting better mobility. As I was mentioning earlier, we need to kind of understand that things are joint centered. If you don't know what a joint is, it's literally where your two bones meet. And the purpose of that joint is to be able to move. If it wasn't supposed to move, there wouldn't be a joint. It would have just been a long bone. That's why my argument for why we need to keep moving and loading our spines is because there are so many joints there. They are meant to move. That's why we're so mobile. If not, it would have been a long rod. So you have to understand how joints move and the fundamentals of those movements, of where the joints articulate, which is also known as arthrokinematics. And if you don't know that, it's okay. I wouldn't know it if I didn't go to physical therapy school. But if you don't fully understand that most joints need to have rotation before they're able to move in any linear direction, then you might not be able to program adequately for yourself. So we really have to look and understand what joints do and what they're supposed to do, because we have to prioritize certain movements before others, or certain adaptations before others. You also have to work on building a better connection to your body before you start to load things and do all the fun stuff. Again, sometimes mobility flows can be helpful. I record some different variations of them in Kinstretch so we can get better control and strength, but it's more generalized. But if you were to take that class, a lot of the times you would maybe be really confused or just not able to do a lot of it because you won't even know how to access or control, or you won't know much about your body. So when it comes to hierarchy, you also have to start with the very basics of knowing your body. And that's why I always will tell people cars is the starting point, daily cars, along with the fact that you have to start maintaining before you can start improving. You're losing range of motion on a regular basis if you're not maintaining, because that's how our bodies work because of entropy, which I'll probably talk about in a future episode. But we have to start with certain things. There's a hierarchy. And most people just, again, pick things off of what they see, or focus on, they pick exercises based off what they see on Instagram and just try them, instead of knowing, wow, okay, maybe that's level 10 and I actually need a level 2 exercise. How do you know that? You might not. Again, that's why sometimes finding a coach is helpful, or at least doing a Kinstretch class is helpful. Or the other thing that people prioritize is exercises based off of what they feel. So a lot of people will come to me and they'll be like, I have this hip flexor pain. And they will say those exact words. Almost never, actually never in the times of all the times in my past 4.5 years of being a clinician, has somebody actually had hip flexor pain. They've had pain where their hip flexor, or where they think their hip flexor is, which is in the front, but it's actually never been hip flexor issues, ever. as far as I'm concerned. I can't ever be sure of that, of course, but 90% sure that their hip flexors were not the painful thing. So when people see, okay, or we do a quick Google search of anatomy, a lot of the anatomy pictures you see are going to be cartoon drawings and their artist's rendition of what they think the human body looks like. It's not. If you've never dissected a cadaver, you can never fully understand that the pretty picture you see on Google of what a muscle looks like on your body is not really what it is. There's so much stuff that is in that area of your hip flexor that you won't know if it's your hip flexor. You just feel pain in the front of your hip. And most people will feel pain in that area or in any area and then be like, I need exercises, mobility exercises for that area. Yes, we do need to assess that area and make sure that area has what it needs, but sometimes that area is the weakest link. And it's just where too much stress is going through. And so we have to figure out what is all lacking and what's contributing to the actual cause of the problem. And or is that referring from like a nerve, which is actually problematic from your spine? You don't know until you go get assessed by a clinician. But those are just things I want you to understand of the hierarchy. It's not just picking exercises based off of what you feel. It's actually like there's a science. If I could just get like you to understand anything throughout this, there's a science and there's just a way to start thinking about things when it comes to mobility. The last mistake people usually make is they lack progressive overload. So this is very true for any realm of mobility or corrective, quote unquote, corrective exercises for movement. They do the same exercises, even in rehab a lot. They'll do the same exercises over and over and over again forever. And this is something that just doesn't make sense if we're applying the exercise science principles to our programming for mobility. So obviously, we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but progressive overload just means we need to slowly progress things, increase the challenge. Otherwise, our body is going to accommodate because it's no longer challenging for us because our body's getting better at what we're doing, which is the whole point of doing the exercise. So we always have to make sure we're progressively overloading some way, shape, or form with our mobility exercises. I will say it might be and will most likely be way slower than normal. So when we're progressing in the gym and it's pure strength gains, we can add 5 pounds every week or two or 10 pounds or whatever if you're doing a linear progression. And that's pretty quick because there's just some neural adaptations, like your nervous system adaptations are pretty fast. But when it comes to like changing the tissue strength or the tissue quality into healthier collagen or creating more joint space or getting more of your end range of motion strength, the progress is like millimeters over time. It is sloth-like. And usually we will track like, oh, I was able to get into the position faster, or I was able to get a little bit further in my stretch, or the stretch was no longer an 8 out of 10 miserableness. It was actually only a 6 out of 10. Or I realized that the clock, like the 2 minutes for my stretch went by so much faster this time, or my foot was able to lift off the ground a half an inch today finally after months. So just understand that, yes, we do need to progressively overload, but like it's way slower. So it takes some time to change your tendon and ligament strength and tissues compared to just building a squat strength. But we still should be doing that. And ways that we're going to do that, things that we might be thinking about is just increasing the reps of our liftoffs, maybe increasing the time under tension, so holding our stretches a little bit longer, maybe adding additional like rounds of isometrics, like pails and rails. Again, I'm using acronyms here, so if you've never heard of these, bear with me. We might have to create an entire episode where I kind of go through some of this stuff, but this is FRC lingo. I use it a lot in Kinstretch, and I've been wanting to put together some vocabulary explanations, definitions, but I just have not yet. So don't worry about it if you don't understand these, but for those of you who are already doing some of this, I just wanted to give you some ideas on what you need to be thinking about, and that is how we do things. So I tell a lot of people if they're in Kinstretch and there's an exercise or a class that felt really great, or an exercise that they really sucked at, and they want to get better at it, to start doing it more often, maybe a few times a week or twice a week with their strength training program, and slowly start progressing it. So usually with liftoffs, we'll hold them for like 5 seconds. So we might do like 3 or 5 rounds of them. And so the way that I'll help people progress is add another set every like other week, and or add another couple of reps, or let's make your holds like 10 seconds or something along those lines, just to make it harder a little bit as we go. This is something that's also really important, because when we go through rehab, a lot of times somebody will have a flare up, and this is going to kind of delineate or explain the chronic injury cycle, which I've talked about before and made a couple posts on. But we will go through a chronic, or not a chronic, an acute flare up. So something gets like flared up in our hip or our low back. And so we go to therapy. They give us some exercises that feel good. They're like new movements, maybe some stretches. And it's all just kind of like holding for 30 seconds for a stretch, or do these like clamshells. There's not real rhyme or reason other than general movement around the area tends to feel good. And it's different than what you did before, so it feels good. And so you do those exercises. Maybe they add like a band at the end, and then you go back to the gym. And you're back in the gym and you're lifting, like squatting 200 pounds, but you were doing banded clamshells on the desk. Sorry, not on the desk, on the table. That's not going to prepare you enough for the demands or what your hip needs, the strength it needs for actual lifting of 200 pounds. There was no progressive overload to prepare you for that. It's a big jump in your workouts again. And so maybe then your back starts to feel tight because you didn't really address any of your low back mobility. You just did a bunch of random stretches, and the stretches were 30 seconds, which didn't really do much except make you feel good temporarily, because we need to hold stretches for 90 seconds to 2 minutes before our fibroblasts really care about what we're doing, and if we want to create any actual physiological changes in our body. So then you go back to lifting again and you feel better, and you don't really know if it's actually the therapy that helped you or if it's just the fact that time passed. And then your back flares up again and you go back to therapy, or you don't go back to therapy and you just grab those lists of exercises and you follow those again. And that cycle just keeps happening over and over again, because we're never really tackling the actual problem. You're missing the 3 things that I just covered, which are lack of intention and selection of exercises and implementation. It's just random exercises. They're not actually intentional for the adaptations we need. You're lacking priority. Unfortunately, your physical therapist may have not prioritized what you actually need for your spine, and or you're lacking progressive overload because you didn't know or your therapist didn't know how to progressively overload, or doesn't have the time to work on that with you, or insurance didn't let you, whatever the reason. That's what often ends up happening. I work with people who typically go down that path and their injury gets worse and worse, or they just get fed up with it because it starts to limit their ability to lift, and they just start modifying and modifying and modifying until they feel like they can't do any of the things they want to anymore, and it always flares up. Then they come to see me and we actually have to get a little bit more specific and intentional. And I didn't make all of this stuff up based off of some made up thing. This is exactly what's happened to majority of the people that I work with. That's the system. And it all boils down to not understanding mobility training and not understanding approaching mobility work with the understanding that we have to be a little bit more specific with exercise science principles and with our implementation of them, and look at things from the inside out when it comes to building better joints and tackling the things that are causing the problems that we've had for so long. So that is the gist of Mobility Training 101 and how it relates to strength training. So mobility work is strength training, but not all strength training is mobility work. So we need to use the strength training principles in our mobility, but we need to make sure that we don't assume that we are taking care of our joints just because we are doing pattern exercises. If you are doing a squat, even if it's full depth, you're not hitting your full hip internal rotation. That's just a fact. So we really need to understand that both are necessary. Sometimes more mobility work, sometimes less, depending on our goals, but Most training programs need to have both, especially if you're older and have neglected this type of training for whatever reason. Then you might need to start prioritizing it more. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of things. We will probably be discussing this a lot more in the future, but I wanted to have a great starting article so we could break down some of the common understandings of mobility, like foam rolling and smashing your tissues, mobility flows in yoga, and actually talk about what mobility is and then compare it to strength training and wrap it all up with those three things that we typically biggest mistakes that we typically make with mobility training that cause us to not get the results that we're looking for. So if you have any questions or you enjoyed any part of this podcast, please let me know. Share to Instagram, tag me in it, send me a message or send me an email, whatever. I hope that you enjoy whatever you're doing after this podcast. And I will see you in the next one.